The Maiden Voyage of the Eclipsed Star, October 1887. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly beneath iron clouds, while the steamship, the Eclipsed Star, moved through freezing waters like a wandering ghost. Her engines thundered beneath the decks day and night, shaking every cabin with a rhythm like a dying heartbeat. Celebrated across England as a masterpiece of engineering, the ship carried aristocrats, businessmen, immigrants, and dreamers toward New York City. Yet whispers among sailors spoke of illness spreading below deck. Before the vessel had even left Liverpool Harbor, Miss Eleanor Whitmore stood alone near the railing, wrapped in a dark navy coat, her gloved hands trembling against the bitter wind. At 23, she possessed the beauty expected of a Victorian lady: pale skin, dark curls beneath a velvet hat, and sorrowful gray eyes that carried quiet sadness. Her father had arranged her engagement to a wealthy American industrialist she had never met, hoping marriage would restore the family's fading fortune. Eleanor, however, felt less like a bride and more like a prisoner crossing the ocean toward her fate. Inside the grand dining hall, chandeliers glittered above, wealthy passengers drinking champagne, while violins played softly. But Eleanor could not endure the suffocating elegance. She longed for freedom and one honest moment untouched by society's expectations. As sea mist curled across the deck, she noticed a man standing alone near the stern. He wore only a worn wool coat and sketched quietly inside a notebook despite the freezing air. When Eleanor stepped closer, she saw he was drawing the ocean itself, every violent wave captured in astonishing detail. "You should not stand so close to the edge, miss," he said softly without looking up. His voice carried the roughness of the lower classes, yet there was intelligence beneath it. "And yet you stand there yourself," Eleanor replied. The man finally looked at her, revealing deep green eyes, shadowed with exhaustion. "I have less to lose than you." His name was Thomas Vale, a third-class passenger traveling to America after years working in the shipyards of Belfast. Though he spoke little of his past, Eleanor sensed hidden pain within him. Over the following days, they met again beneath the stars, while the sea roared around them. Thomas showed her sketches of lonely widows, laughing children, and exhausted workers hidden beneath the polished surface of Victorian society. Yet below deck, the sickness spread silently. A young Irish boy developed a fever so severe he coughed blood onto his blanket, and whispers of consumption and scarlet fever slithered through the corridors like rats in darkness. One storm-filled evening, Eleanor discovered Thomas sitting alone near the boiler rooms, coughing violently into a handkerchief stained faintly with blood.
For several days the sea remained calm, though tension drifted through. The eclipsed star like smoke trapped within cathedral walls. Wealthy passengers continued dancing beneath glittering chandeliers, while servants carried silver trays through perfumed corridors. Yet below first class, another world slowly descended into fear. In the lower decks, children cried through the night as fever spread, among immigrant families crowded into damp cabins. Some whispered it was consumption. Others feared typhus brought from Liverpool streets. The ship's physician, Dr. Horace Bellamy, insisted there was no danger, though even he had begun wearing gloves while treating the sick. Eleanor Whitmore could no longer ignore the horror surrounding her. Every morning brought new rumours whispered by frightened maids and exhausted crewmen. A woman from Dublin had died before sunrise. A sailor collapsed near the engine room, coughing blood across the floorboards. Entire sections of third class had quietly been sealed off from the rest of the ship. Yet above deck, the orchestra continued, playing cheerful waltzes as if music alone could silence death. One evening, Eleanor secretly descended into the forbidden lower corridors, searching for Thomas Vale. The deeper she walked, the colder the air became. Polished walls vanished, replaced by rusted pipes and dim oil lamps. The smell struck her immediately: sickness, sweat, and coal smoke. She found Thomas beside a narrow bunk where an elderly man struggled to breathe beneath stained blankets. "You should not be here," Thomas warned softly. "People are dying," Eleanor whispered. "Why is no one helping them?" Thomas glanced toward the pale faces hidden in shadow. "Because poor people die every day, Miss Whitmore. Society simply prefers not to witness it." His words unsettled her deeply. For the first time, Eleanor understood how easily suffering could hide beneath luxury. Thomas admitted he had seen tuberculosis spread through Belfast factories years earlier, and recognized the same symptoms aboard the ship: fever, weakness, blood in the lungs. Eleanor remembered the blood-stained handkerchief he had hidden days earlier. "You are ill yourself," she whispered. Thomas remained silent before quietly admitting, "I was sick long before boarding this ship." Beneath the dim lantern light, his face appeared pale and exhausted, though his eyes carried the calm acceptance of a man already familiar with death. Before Eleanor could answer, violent coughing erupted from the old man in the bunk. Blood splattered across the blanket as terrified cries echoed through the corridor, while the eclipsed star continued forward into the endless black Atlantic night.
By the fifth night aboard the eclipsed star, the Atlantic had turned violent. Massive waves crashed against the iron hull, while freezing rain struck the windows like thrown gravel. Above deck, frightened passengers gathered inside the grand saloon, pretending not to notice the fear spreading through the ship. The orchestra still played beneath glittering ships, but conversations had become whispers. Everyone had heard the rumors. People were dying below deck, and entire corridors had been sealed shut. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the staircase, listening as two wealthy gentlemen quietly argued about whether the captain should return to England. Before the sickness spread further, one claimed it was influenza. The other whispered the word tuberculosis with visible fear. Before either man noticed her, Eleanor slipped away and returned to her cabin, where another folded note waited beneath the door. "Meet me below deck tonight. Come alone. TV near midnight." She wrapped herself in a heavy coat and quietly descended into the lower corridors. The deeper she walked, the colder and darker the ship became. Elegant carpets disappeared, replaced by wet iron floors and rusted pipes dripping from the ceiling. Lanterns flickered weakly, while distant coughing echoed through the narrow passageways. At the final staircase, Eleanor froze in shock. An iron gate had been locked across the corridor, separating third class from the rest of the ship. Guards armed with revolvers stood nearby, while frightened passengers crowded behind the bars. Mothers held crying children, while sick men lay beneath sweat-soaked blankets. Thomas Vale slowly emerged from the shadows on the other side of the gate. His face looked pale beneath the lantern light. Exhaustion darkened his eyes. "The captain ordered a quarantine this morning," he explained quietly. "No one leaves until the doctor decides who is infected." Eleanor stared at the trapped families in horror. "They cannot imprison them like animals." Thomas gave a bitter smile. "Doc, two men like Captain Osh. Poor passengers are cargo, no different from coal." Suddenly, violent coughing overtook him. He turned away sharply, pressing a handkerchief against his mouth. Even in the dim light, Eleanor saw fresh blood staining the cloth. Fear tightened painfully inside her chest. "Thomas, that..." How long have you been ill? He hesitated before answering softly. Since Belfast. The doctors called it consumption. Tears burned behind Eleanor's eyes. Society had taught her to fear sickness. Yet, standing before him now, none of those rules mattered anymore. She stepped closer to the iron bars separating them. You should have told me and watched you run from me, he asked quietly. Before Eleanor could answer, screams erupted deeper within the quarantine corridor. A young woman collapsed onto the floor while blood spilled from her lips. Panic spread instantly among the trapped passengers as thunder cracked across the Atlantic sky and the eclipsed star sailed deeper into darkness. The storm worsened with every passing hour. Waves hammered against the hull of the eclipsed star so violently that lamps swung from the ceilings and passengers woke, trembling in their cabins as iron groaned deep within the ship. After the horror inside the quarantined corridor, panic began spreading. Even through the polished elegance of first-class, servants no longer hid their fear. Silver trays shook in their hands, and several maids refused to descend below deck at all. Rumors traveled faster than the Atlantic wind. Some claimed dozens were already dead. Others whispered the captain intended to abandon the infected passengers entirely once they reached New York Harbor. Eleanor Whitmore could think only of Thomas Vale. His pale face haunted her thoughts long after she returned to her cabin. Near dawn, she made a dangerous decision. Wrapping herself in a dark cloak, she slipped through the silent corridors toward the infirmary, hoping to speak with Dr. Horace Bellamy directly. She found the physician alone, inside his office, surrounded by medical journals and bottles of laudanum. Exhaustion darkened his eyes. When Eleanor demanded the truth, the doctor hesitated before quietly locking the door. The illness is tuberculosis, he admitted at last, but something else spreads with it. Severe fever, delirium, bleeding unlike anything I have witnessed before. Eleanor felt cold fear tighten inside her chest. Then why does the captain continue forward? Dr. Bellamy removed his spectacles with trembling hands. Because if word reaches New York before we arrive, this ship will never dock. The company will be ruined. Captain Ashcombe intends to keep the situation contained until land is in sight. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. Contained? People are dying, and more will die if panic begins, the doctor answered grimly. Before Eleanor could respond, a deafening crash shook the room. Somewhere above them, passengers screamed. The ship lurched violently to one side as thunder exploded across the black ocean. Dr. Bellamy rushed into the corridor with Eleanor close behind. Crewmen raced through the passageways, shouting over the storm. One of the boilers had partially flooded during the rough seas, and freezing water now poured into the lower engine compartments. Eleanor's blood turned to ice when she realized which decks would flood first. The quarantined corridors. Without waiting for permission, she ran toward the stairwell. As she descended deeper into the ship, steam and icy seawater filled the narrow passages. The electric lights flickered weakly before dying altogether, leaving only oil lanterns trembling in darkness. Then she heard it, coughing, screaming, and somewhere beyond the iron gates separating third class from the rest of the ship, Thomas Vale calling her name through the chaos. Freezing seawater rushed through the lower corridors of the eclipsed star like a living creature awakened beneath the ship. Lantern light reflected across black water while terrified passengers screamed behind the iron gates. Mothers lifted children onto narrow bunks to keep them above the rising flood. Men pounded desperately against the bars until their fists bled. Eleanor Whitmore forced herself forward through the chaos. Her boots submerged in icy water as steam hissed from broken pipes overhead. Thomas Vale remained behind the locked barrier, gripping the iron bars with shaking hands. His breathing had grown weak and uneven. Blood stained the collar of his coat, though he tried to hide it from her. "You must leave this place," he warned hoarsely. "If the fever reaches first class, they will seal the entire ship." Eleanor ignored him and turned toward the guards standing farther down the corridor. "Open these gates immediately," she demanded. The older guard hesitated nervously. "Captain's orders, Miss. No infected passenger is to leave. Quarantine day. We'll drown down here." "Then God help them," the man whispered. Rage unlike anything Eleanor had known surged through her chest. Victorian manners, obedience, reputation, all the rules that had shaped her entire life suddenly felt meaningless beside the suffering surrounding her. Before either guard could react, she seized the lantern from the wall and smashed it violently against the locking mechanism. Beside the gate, glass exploded across the corridor. Flames briefly erupted before seawater extinguished them in darkness. The damaged lock cracked open with a sharp metallic snap. Panic followed instantly. Dozens of trapped passengers forced themselves through the opening while guards shouted helplessly over the storm. Thomas grabbed Eleanor's arm before the crowd separated them. For one brief moment, they stood together, surrounded by smoke, seawater, and terrified voices echoing through the ship. Then another violent tremor shook the eclipsed star from end to end, somewhere deep below. Then came the terrible sound of twisting iron. The ship had struck something. Beneath the water, passengers fell screaming as the floor tilted sharply sideways. Lamps shattered. Steam burst from ruptured pipes far above the decks. The ship's warning bell began ringing through the darkness of the Atlantic night. Thomas stared upward with hollow eyes already filled with dread. "The hull is breaking," he said quietly. "This ship is dying." The warning bell echoed endlessly through the eclipsed star while chaos consumed every deck of the dying vessel. Passengers flooded the staircases carrying children, luggage, jewelry, and whatever pieces of their former lives they could still cling to. The elegant illusion of class and status vanished completely. Wealthy gentlemen shoved servants aside in terror. Women screamed prayers into the darkness. Somewhere above the storm, the orchestra continued playing, trembling waltzes inside the grand saloon, as if music alone could hold the ship. Together, for a few moments longer, Eleanor Whitmore struggled beside Thomas Vale through corridors now tilting sharply toward the freezing Atlantic. Water poured through cracks in the walls while steam hissed from shattered pipes. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and sickness. Several crewmen attempted to organize passengers toward the lifeboats, but panic spread faster than commands. One staircase collapsed entirely beneath the weight of the crowd, throwing dozens into the flooded lower deck below. Eleanor nearly lost her footing as the ship groaned violently again. Thomas caught her arm despite his weakening strength. His face had become frighteningly pale, and each breath ended in painful coughing. "You need a lifeboat," he whispered. "There are still some above deck." "Not without you." Thomas gave her a faint, exhausted smile. "Eleanor, look at me." She already knew the truth before he spoke again. Fever burned in his eyes. Blood stained his lips. The disease consuming the ship had already claimed him long before the Atlantic storm arrived. "I will not survive this crossing," he sighed softly. Tears mixed with rain across Eleanor's face. "Do not say that." Another deafening sound erupted beneath them. Iron screamed somewhere deep within the hull as the ship tilted even farther toward the black ocean. Passengers slid across the flooded floor while lanterns shattered against the walls. Above them came the terrible cries of people trapped near the lifeboats. There were not enough spaces for everyone. Thomas pulled Eleanor into a narrow corridor away from the screaming crowds. For one brief moment, the chaos faded around them. Only the distant orchestra remained, playing a final broken waltz somewhere within the ship. All my life, Thomas whispered weakly, I believed people like you lived in another world entirely, untouched by suffering. Eleanor gripped his trembling hands tightly, and all my life I believed freedom belonged. Only two people brave enough to reach for it. Thomas leaned closer, his forehead resting gently against hers while the dying ship groaned beneath them. Then suddenly, the lights of the eclipse star failed all at once. Darkness swallowed the corridors. The music stopped. And somewhere in the freezing Atlantic night, the ocean began rushing violently into the heart of the ship. Darkness consumed the eclipsed star completely. Only the storm remained alive above the Atlantic, thunder rolling across the heavens while freezing seawater tore through the sinking ship. Passengers stumbled blindly through tilted corridors, illuminated only by scattered lantern flames and flashes of lightning beyond shattered windows. Panic had become something animal now. Men fought each other near the lifeboats. Children screamed for parents already lost somewhere below deck. The great steamship that had once symbolized human progress now sounded like a dying creature, breaking apart beneath the sea. Eleanor Whitmore clung to Thomas Vale as they struggled upward through the chaos. Water surged around their legs with terrifying force. Every staircase had become slick with seawater and blood. Somewhere nearby, a woman cried out for help before vanishing beneath the flooding corridor entirely. Eleanor tried not to look back. Thomas grew weaker with every step. His breathing rattled painfully in his chest while fever burned through him like fire beneath pale skin. Twice he nearly collapsed, yet still he forced himself onward beside her. When they finally reached the upper deck, the storm struck them with merciless violence. Rain lashed across the ship while enormous black waves crashed over the railings. Smoke poured from the funnels into the night sky. One of the great iron chimneys suddenly groaned and collapsed into the ocean with a deafening roar, dragging screaming passengers into the freezing water below. Lifeboats were already being lowered unevenly into the violent sea. Some overturned instantly upon touching the waves. Others departed half empty, while desperate crowds surged toward them in terror. Armed officers fired warning shots into the air, attempting to force order upon the madness. Eleanor searched the chaos desperately for a path forward, but Thomas stopped suddenly near the railing. Another violent coughing fit overtook him. This time, blood streamed openly between his fingers onto the rain-soaked deck. He could barely remain standing. Thomas, Eleanor whispered in horror. He looked toward the dark Atlantic, stretching endlessly around them. I cannot outrun this sickness anymore. We will find a boat even if we do. The fever will follow me there. It will follow you too. Eleanor shook her head fiercely through tears and rain. I do not care. For a moment, Thomas simply stared at her, as if trying to memorize her face against the storm. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and removed the weathered sketchbook he had carried since the beginning of the voyage. He placed it into her trembling hands. If you survive, he said softly, remember that I existed. Before Eleanor could answer, a horrifying sound tore through the night. Deep beneath them, the hull of the eclipsed star cracked violently apart. The entire ship lurched downward toward the freezing black Atlantic as thousands of terrified voices screamed into the storm. The eclipsed star began to die beneath the Atlantic in terrible slow motion. Her enormous hull split apart as freezing seawater consumed the lower decks one chamber at a time. Steam exploded upward from the ruptured engines while the stern lifted violently toward the storm-filled sky. Passengers slid screaming across the tilted deck into the black ocean below. Lifeboats vanished among monstrous waves, illuminated only by flashes of lightning. Eleanor Whitmore could barely breathe through the chaos surrounding her. She clutched Thomas Vale's sketchbook tightly against her chest, while icy rain soaked through her coat. Around them, the final moments of civilization collapsed completely. Wealth no longer mattered. Titles no longer mattered. The Atlantic swallowed everyone equally. Thomas leaned weakly against the railing, struggling for breath as blood mixed with rain upon his lips. Even standing seemed to exhaust him now. Yet despite the terror around them, his eyes remained strangely calm. "Listen to me carefully," he whispered. Eleanor shook her head through tears. "No, you must survive. This, I will not leave you." Here, another violent shooter tore through the dying ship. Metal screamed beneath their feet, far below them. Thousands of tons of seawater rushed into the broken hull with the sound of an avalanche. Passengers began throwing themselves directly into the ocean rather than waiting for the ship to pull them under. Thomas gently placed his trembling hand against Eleanor's face. "All my life, I feared disappearing without meaning anything to anyone," he sighed softly. "Then I met you." Eleanor could no longer stop crying. For the first time in her carefully controlled Victorian life, she felt completely powerless against fate. Thomas looked toward a nearby lifeboat still struggling to lower into the raging sea. "When the ship falls completely, the suction will drag everyone beneath the surface. You need to leave now." That Eleanor refused to move. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, gathering what little strength remained inside him. Then, suddenly, he pulled her toward the lifeboat through the panicked crowd. A crewman grabbed Eleanor's arm and forced her inside among terrified strangers packed shoulder to shoulder. She screamed Thomas's name immediately, fighting to climb back onto the deck, but strong hands restrained her as the ropes lowered the boat toward the freezing Atlantic below. Through the storm, she saw him one final time standing alone beside the railing of the eclipsed star ring, and seawater whipped across his dark coat while the dying ship tilted sharply beneath him. Even from a distance, she could see the faint sadness in his eyes. Then Thomas raised one hand toward her in silent farewell. Seconds later, the stern of the eclipsed star rose almost vertically into the storm. The enormous ship seemed to hang, suspended against the black heavens for one impossible moment before, disappearing beneath the Atlantic forever. The screams faded slowly into darkness. The survivors drifted through the black Atlantic beneath a sky without mercy. Rain continued falling over the shattered remains of the eclipsed star, while broken debris floated silently across the freezing water. The great ship was gone. Only scattered lifeboats and the distant cries of dying passengers remained upon the endless sea. Eleanor Whitmore sat trembling inside the overcrowded lifeboat, soaked to the bone beneath her dark Victorian coat. Around her, survivors wept quietly or stared into the darkness with hollow eyes. One elderly woman clutched a silver crucifix while whispering prayers for souls already lost beneath the waves. Another man coughed weakly into a blood-stained cloth, his feverish breathing echoing through the silence. The sickness had survived the sinking. Eleanor held Thomas Vale's sketchbook tightly against her chest as if it were the last living piece of him remaining in the world. She could still see him standing upon the deck of the dying ship, moments before the Atlantic swallowed him forever. The memory burned inside her with unbearable clarity. Near dawn, the storm finally weakened. Pale gray light slowly emerged across the ocean, revealing the true horror left behind by the disaster. Bodies floated among shattered wood and broken luggage. Some remained frozen with their arms outstretched toward lifeboats that had never reached them. Others drifted silently beneath, thin layers of sea mist like ghosts, refusing to disappear. Several survivors began sobbing openly at the sight. Then Eleanor heard it. A cough, weak, ragged, human. She turned sharply toward the far side of the lifeboat, where one of the sailors pointed into the water. At first she saw only wreckage floating beside them. Then a pale hand emerged from the waves, gripping a broken wooden plank. "Dear God," whispered the sailor. Thomas Vale still lived, barely conscious and half frozen. He drifted within the black Atlantic while blood stained the seawater around him. Eleanor cried out his name instantly, nearly throwing herself from the lifeboat before the others restrained her. The sailors hesitated in terror. One glanced toward the blood upon Thomas's lips and stepped backward immediately. "He carries the consumption," another muttered fearfully. "If we bring him aboard, we risk everyone." Eleanor stared at them in disbelief. Even after surviving the sinking, fear of disease remained stronger than compassion. Thomas lifted his head weakly toward the lifeboat. His green eyes found Eleanor through the morning mist, exhausted, yet still painfully alive. Then, slowly, through trembling lips, blew from the freezing Atlantic. He spoke only 3 words: "Do not leave."
For several terrible seconds, the lifeboat drifted beside Thomas Vale while the survivors argued over whether he should be saved. The freezing Atlantic moved slowly around him, black as spilled ink beneath the pale Victorian dawn. His trembling hands barely held the broken plank, keeping him alive. Blood stained the seawater near his mouth each time he coughed. Eleanor Whitmore could not bear the sight another moment. "Pull him aboard," she demanded. One of the sailors shook his head immediately. "The man carries consumption. Look at him." Another survivor, a wealthy gentleman wrapped in a fur-lined coat, spoke with visible disgust. "If he infects this boat, we are all condemned." Eleanor stared at them in horror. Even after witnessing hundreds die beneath the Atlantic, they still clung to class and fear more tightly than humanity itself. Thomas's strength was fading rapidly now. His eyes struggled to remain open against exhaustion and fever. Without thinking further, Eleanor seized one of the oars herself and leaned dangerously over the side of the lifeboat toward him. "Take my hand," she cried. Thomas hesitated weakly. "Eleanor, no, please." Their fingers finally touched through the freezing rain. Several passengers shouted in protest as Eleanor and one reluctant sailor dragged Thomas into the crowded lifeboat. The moment he collapsed inside, people moved away from him in terror as though death itself had entered among them. No one offered him a blanket. No one spoke to him except Eleanor. She knelt beside him, despite the whispers surrounding her. Victorian society had spent her entire life teaching her to fear men like Thomas. Poor men, sick men, forgotten men. Yet here in the middle of the Atlantic, surrounded by death and ruin, those rules no longer seemed human to her at all. Thomas's body shook violently from fever and cold. Eleanor removed her own coat and wrapped it around his shoulders. Despite the freezing wind cutting across the lifeboat, "You will become ill too," he whispered weakly. "Then I shall be ill beside you." For the first time since the sinking, a faint smile touched his pale face. Hours passed beneath a gray and merciless sky. Several survivors developed coughing fits before noon. Dr. Bellamy, rescued aboard another nearby boat, quietly admitted the sickness had likely spread long before. The eclipsed star sank. Tuberculosis, scarlet fever, perhaps worse, the crowded lifeboats had become floating chambers of infection drifting helplessly across the Atlantic. By evening, a thick fog surrounded the survivors completely. The ocean vanished into white silence around them. Somewhere within the mist, another lifeboat rang a small bell repeatedly, searching for lost survivors hidden in the fog. Then suddenly the sound stopped. Eleanor looked upward uneasily. Out beyond the mist, a massive dark silhouette slowly emerged across the water. Another ship. Silent, motionless, waiting in the fog like a ghost upon the Atlantic.
The dark vessel emerged slowly through the Atlantic fog like an apparition summoned from the dead. Its enormous black hole drifted silently beside the lifeboats, without a single lantern burning along its decks. No smoke rose from its funnels. No voices echoed across the water. The ship appeared abandoned by the living themselves. Fear spread immediately among the survivors. Several passengers crossed themselves, while others whispered prayers beneath trembling breaths. Victorian sailors often spoke of ghost ships wandering the Atlantic after storms, carrying plague, madness, or souls cursed to remain forever at sea. Eleanor Whitmore watched the silent vessel through the mist while Thomas Vale lay weak beside her, wrapped in her coat. Fever had worsened his condition terribly. His skin burned with unnatural heat despite the freezing wind, and at times he drifted in and out of consciousness, speaking fragments of memories from Belfast shipyards and forgotten streets filled with sickness. Dr. Bell's lifeboat drifted closer through the fog. The physician stared at the silent ship with visible unease. That vessel was reported missing nearly 3 months ago, he whispered to St. Aldwyn. Several survivors looked toward him in horror. One sailor spoke shakily. Impossible. She vanished. Crossing from Lisbon, Bellamy nodded grimly during a cholera outbreak. Silence fell instantly across the lifeboats. Cholera, one of the great Victorian nightmares. Entire cities had emptied before it. Families vanished within days beneath fever, vomiting, and death. Even now, many believed the disease traveled through cursed air itself. The St. Aldwyn drifted closer still, enormous and black, beside the tiny lifeboats tossed by the Atlantic waves. Ropes hung loose from her rails. Torn curtains moved faintly behind dark windows. Yet not a single soul appeared upon the decks. Then suddenly a bell rang once, somewhere deep aboard the ghostly ship. The sound echoed through the fog like a funeral toll. Eleanor felt Thomas stir weakly beside her. His eyes opened slowly toward the dark vessel. "People are alive on that ship," he whispered hoarsely. Before anyone could answer, another sound emerged from the fog, coughing, violent coughing from somewhere aboard St. Aldwyn. A lantern suddenly appeared near the upper railing, held by a thin figure barely visible through the mist. The figure swayed unsteadily before raising one trembling arm toward the lifeboats below. Then came a voice, weak, desperate, "Please, help us." The survivors recoiled instantly in terror. Some demanded the lifeboats row away immediately before infection reached them all. Others stared upward, frozen between fear and pity. Eleanor looked toward the dying strangers aboard the silent ship and felt a terrible truth settle inside her heart. The Atlantic had become a floating graveyard of disease and suffering, and there was nowhere left to escape from it now. Against the protests of nearly every survivor, Dr. Bellamy finally ordered several lifeboats brought alongside the St. Aldwyn. The decision filled the air with terror. Some believed boarding the silent vessel meant inviting death itself among them. Others feared remaining in the open Atlantic even more. Thick fog still surrounded the sea in every direction, and no rescue ship had appeared since dawn. Eleanor Whitmore helped support Thomas Vale as sailors secured ropes against the towering black hull. The moment she stepped aboard the St. Aldwyn, a terrible smell filled the air. Rotting wood, salt water, illness. The decks were slick with rain and strangely abandoned, as though the crew had vanished in the middle of their duties months earlier. Half-empty teacups remained upon tables beneath soaked blankets. A child's doll rested near the staircase covered in mildew. Somewhere deep within the ship came the distant sound of coughing. Echoing through the corridors, a small group of survivors followed, Dr. Bellamy carrying lanterns through the dark interior. The St. Aldwyn seemed frozen in time beneath the Atlantic fog. Victorian paintings hung crooked upon damp walls. Chandeliers swayed gently overhead, although no wind entered the corridors. Then Eleanor heard soft singing somewhere ahead, a hymn. Weak voices trembling together in the darkness. They followed the sound into a small chapel hidden within the center of the ship. Dozens of sick passengers lay across wooden pews, wrapped in blankets stained with blood and fever sweat. Thin faces turned weakly toward the newcomers as lantern light entered the room. Several women clutched rosaries, while a priest quietly read prayers beside the dying. Cholera had devastated the ship months earlier, but now another illness spread among the survivors remaining aboard. Consumption, tuberculosis. Eleanor saw it immediately in their hollow eyes and crimson-stained claws. Pressed against pale mouths, Victorian medicine could do almost nothing against it. Dr. Bellamy moved carefully among the sick, examining patients while fear darkened his expression further with every passing minute. The disease has changed, he whispered privately to Eleanor. Tuberculosis alone does not spread this quickly. Nearby Thomas collapsed suddenly against one of the pews, overcome by violent coughing. Blood spilled openly across his hands as his body trembled from fever. Several frightened survivors backed away immediately. The chapel of the St. Aldwyn fell into terrified silence. After the lantern flames flickered, sick passengers clutched blankets tightly, while the priest slowly rose from beside the altar, his trembling hands gripping a silver cross. Beyond the chapel doors, the dark corridor remained empty. Yet everyone had heard the young girl's warning. Someone else was aboard the ship. Eleanor Whitmore held Thomas Vale close against her shoulder, while thunder murmured faintly outside beyond the fog. His fever had become severe. At times, he no longer recognized where he was. His breathing rattled painfully inside his chest, and blood stained the handkerchief pressed weakly against his lips. Dr. Bill feared the sickness had spread through his lungs beyond recovery. Then footsteps echoed softly through the corridor outside the chapel, slow, measured, unnatural. In the silence surrounding them, several survivors gasped quietly. The priest raised his lantern toward the doorway as their footsteps stopped just beyond the light. A figure emerged slowly from the darkness. It was a woman dressed entirely in black, Victorian mourning clothes with a veil covering most of her pale face. Rainwater dripped from her long coat onto the wooden floorboards, though no one had heard any door open aboard the ship. She appeared almost ghost-like beneath the trembling lantern light. "Who are you?" Dr. Bellamy demanded cautiously. The woman looked toward the frightened survivors with strangely hollow eyes visible beneath the veil. "My name is Margaret Whitlock," she answered softly. "I remained aboard to care for the dying after the crew abandoned us." Her voice carried exhaustion deeper than grief itself. Eleanor noticed immediately how thin the woman appeared. Her pale hands trembled faintly, and hidden beneath the scent of seawater lingered the unmistakable smell of sickness. Consumption. Margaret slowly walked among the pews, studying the fevered passengers resting there Several seemed relieved merely by her presence, as though she had cared for them for many weeks already. "You should not remain in the lower chapel tonight," Margaret warned quietly. "The fever spreads worse after dark." Dr. Bellamy frowned uneasily. "Diseases do not strengthen at night." Margaret looked toward him with tired sadness. "You still believe this ship carries only disease?" "Before the physician could answer." Violent coughing erupted from Thomas again. Blood spilled between his fingers as his body weakened against Eleanor's arms. Margaret approached silently and knelt beside him. For several moments she simply studied his face beneath the lantern glow. Then something changed in her expression. Fear. Real fear. "How long has he been ill?" she whispered. "Several months," Eleanor answered shakily. Margaret's pale lips parted slightly beneath the black veil. "Then he is not the first." The chapel grew colder suddenly. Somewhere deep within the St. Aldwyn came the sound of another bell tolling through the fog-covered ship. "They should still be locked below," she whispered. The banging beneath the floorboards grew louder. Eleanor saw dust falling from the ceiling beams while terrified passengers backed away from the staircase. Then suddenly came the sound of splintering wood far below them, followed by footsteps slowly climbing upward through the darkness beneath the ship. Thomas opened his fevered eyes weakly beside Eleanor. Blood touched his lips as he whispered only one sentence. "The dead are waking." The chapel remained frozen in silence after Margaret Whitlock's warning. Rain whispered faintly against the windows of the St. Aldwyn while sick passengers stared toward the woman in black, mourning clothes with growing dread. Even Dr. Bellamy no longer appeared certain of himself. The old confidence of Victorian medicine had begun crumbling around him ever since. The eclipsed star vanished beneath the Atlantic. Margaret slowly removed her veil. Several survivors gasped quietly at the sight of her face. She could not have been older than 30, yet illness had hollowed her features into something ghost-like. Her skin appeared pale as candle wax, and faint crimson stains marked the lace handkerchief wrapped around her wrist. Consumption had already claimed her long ago. 3 months ago, Margaret began softly. The St. Aldwyn carried infected passengers from Lisbon. Cholera spread first. The crew locked the sick below deck just as your captain did aboard. The eclipsed star. Eleanor felt cold horror tighten inside her chest. The cruelty was the same. Different ship, different victims, same fear. Margaret continued slowly. But after the cholera came another sickness, one the doctors could not explain. The lantern light flickered again as thunder rolled outside the fog-covered ship. People began coughing blood. They suffered terrible fever and hallucinations before death. Yet some survived longer than they should have. Weeks, even months. Dr. Bill frowned uneasily. Tuberculosis can spread aggressively in crowded conditions. Margaret looked directly into his eyes. Tuberculosis does not make dead men rise from their beds after midnight. Several passengers crossed themselves instantly. One woman began quietly sobbing into her hands. Elena felt Thomas tremble weakly beside her. His fevered breathing had become dangerously shallow now. Margaret knelt slowly before him once more. "When did his symptoms worsen?" she asked. "After the sinking," Eleanor whispered. Margaret closed her eyes briefly with visible despair. "The sea carries it faster." Before Eleanor could ask what she meant, a horrifying sound echoed suddenly from somewhere deep beneath the chapel floor. A violent banging, slow first, then louder, as though fists were striking wood from below the ship itself. The survivors froze in terror. The priest gripped his cross tightly while Dr. Bellamy lifted a lantern toward the dark staircase leading downward beneath the chapel. Then came coughing. dozens of voices coughing together somewhere in the darkness below. Deck, wet, ragged, inhumanly weak, Margaret rose immediately, fear overtaking her calm expression for the first time. The footsteps beneath the chapel grew louder with every passing second. Survivors backed away in terror, while the lantern flames trembled violently against the cold walls of the St. Aldwyn. Then the wooden door below burst open. Figures slowly emerged from the darkness beneath the ship. Pale passengers wrapped in burial cloths climbed the staircase. With hollow eyes and blood-stained mouths, some coughed violently as they moved. Others simply stared ahead in silence like souls no longer belonging to the living world. Panic exploded inside the chapel. Women screamed. Men shoved each other toward the exits. The priest dropped his silver cross onto the floorboards as survivors fled into the corridors of the ghost ship. Dr. Bellamy stood frozen in horror, unable to explain what his own eyes witnessed. Margaret Whitlock closed her eyes briefly with quiet despair. "The fever never truly ends," she whispered. Eleanor Whitmore held Thomas tightly beside the altar while chaos consumed the chapel around them. His body burned with fever, yet his trembling hands still searched weakly for hers. "Listen to me," he whispered painfully. Eleanor shook her head through tears. "No, please, do not leave me." Thomas smiled faintly, despite the blood upon his lips. "You gave me something no illness ever could destroy." The infected figures moved closer through the chapel now, coughing endlessly into the darkness. Margaret suddenly seized a lantern from the wall and turned toward Eleanor. "There is one lifeboat still tied behind the ship," she cried. "Go now before the fog lifts." Eleanor hesitated, unable to abandon the dying people surrounding her. Then Thomas weakly touched her face once more. "Live," he whispered. "Live enough for both of us." Tears streamed down Eleanor's cheeks as she finally understood. Love could not always save a life. Sometimes love simply gave suffering meaning before the end. With trembling hands, she kissed him softly beneath the flickering lantern light while thunder rolled faintly beyond the ship. For one final moment, the world seemed silent around them. Then Thomas closed his eyes against her shoulder forever. Eleanor's broken cry echoed through the chapel louder than the storm itself. Margaret pulled her gently toward the corridor as the infected passengers filled the room behind them. Together, they escaped through the fog-covered deck and lowered the final lifeboat into the black Atlantic just as dawn slowly began rising across the horizon. Hours later, the fog finally parted. A rescue vessel appeared beneath the pale morning sun and carried the remaining survivors safely toward New York Harbor. Eleanor never forgot the Atlantic. She never forgot the eclipsed star. And she never forgot Thomas Vale, the poor shipyard artist who taught her that love was worth more than status, wealth, or fear. Years later, she published his sketches across America under his true name, So the World Would. Remember the forgotten souls who suffred beneath Victorian society's elite. Some nights, however, Eleanor still dreamed of the fog. She dreamed of distant bells echoing across black water and a silent ship drifting endlessly beyond the Atlantic mist. Waiting, thank you for reading. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to follow for more Victorian horror, tragedy, romance, and dark tales from the sea.